Really wanted to get your perspective as to why we are in the situation we are in right now, why the violence has been, there has been an uptick here in South Seattle, and what's being done.
You know, that's a good question of why this year makes it different from other years. We've had a lot of shootings, and over my course of my career, I've been involved in a lot of youth violence prevention work, and we've literally tried to figure out ways that we can drive it down. And for many years, we did drive a lot of violence down, and we've seen an increase come back. But this year is an anomaly year. I mean, we are at the highest level in 11 years. We've had 329 shots fired this year. Let me give that in perspective. We had 332 all last year completely. And we still have 2.5 months left. And we're only three shootings away from what that level looks like. 130 of those shots fired are actually occurring in the South Precinct. So almost 40% of the shootings are in one precinct alone. And, you know, this is the challenging time that we're facing. We have seen an uptick in homicides. We are at, 39 incidences of homicides, which is, much higher than we've seen in previous years. And, when it comes down to looking at who this affects, we know it affects Black males. 48% of our victims are Black, and 78% are male. 45% are under the age of 30, and 62% of our homicides are related to gun violence. And so, we've recovered close to 2,300 shell casings. These are astounding numbers this year. And we've got to figure out ways to, have solutions on the upstream of this type of work. And, I've prided many years of my work dedicated to that upstream work and trying to find ways that we do not have to arrest our way out of these issues. But I also know that at times, when we see this type of violence, we've got to also figure out how do we stop it. And there are some times where that's where the police do get involved and do get engaged in bringing some level of justice to families that have seen their loved ones lost. And so it's a balanced of approach of how do we do enforcement, so we bring some closure to the families, as well as how do we do that upstream work on really preventing this type of violence.
Is this a gang-related issue?
When we look at shootings across the whole city and homicides across the whole city, we're seeing just certain numbers. DV is actually pretty stagnant right now. So domestic violence, and while COVID has been an issue of thinking that domestic violence would be up and we would see homicides and domestic violence being up, we're pretty much stagnant. Our homeless community, which had an uptick last year in homicides, is pretty stagnant. But, we also look at only 45% are under the age of 30. And so it's not necessarily all related to gang violence. Some of this is random levels of violence that is occurring, but some is related to gang violence, but it's not all of it.
Let's talk about COVID and the impact here, because the one thing about COVID that we have discovered, actually it's been there, is the fact the racial disparities when it comes to healthcare and so many different issues related to the pandemic. As I said, they've been there. They've always been there. It's just that now there is a bigger focus because we know that they're so severe and people of color are being hit hard by it. But how is COVID impacting this? The fact that we have to stay in shelter, we have to stay in place, we have to be careful about what we're doing. Tough to be together around people that much.
Yeah, I think it's changed our social environment. When you start to think of what I did notice is there wasn't a mass increase in shootings or shots fired at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic. So when around March 3rd, when this kind of city really structured itself into doing more of kind of a lockdown type of COVID response, shootings were pretty, actually, they kind of dipped down a little bit. We actually saw more shootings getting closer to the end of May. In June, June and July were huge spikes in the amount of shootings that we had. And we're still into the COVID pandemic, but the summer months, like every other summer, we do see increases in shootings usually during the summer, because there's more youth that are out, more young adults out, more interaction. But what's strange about this year is that typically we also see an increase of shootings around nightlife, and because of COVID, many businesses aren't open. Many of that nightlife situations aren't open, and so we are constantly trying to figure out how do we, respond to violence. And then what we've also seen is that when we do make arrests, that many of the people that we're arresting aren't necessarily even in the city, and that is a part of, when we start to talk about health disparities and criminal justice disparities, it also it lends the discussion to the gentrification that has occurred, where many people have moved outside the city and are coming into the city at times, and when they see somebody that they have a disagreement with, they're picking up a gun and using it for that level of violence.
So one of the things that you have done since you have taken over as chief, as the interim chief, is that you announced sort of a reorganization of your officers and how you're going to deploy them. How are you applying that with dealing with the violence then in South Seattle?
Yeah, so Friday was probably, so we brought 100 officers back into patrol. We've created this community response group that has also been doing some of our roll calls in the community, going out and meeting with business folks and residents, and trying to interact and develop some level of understanding of the community that they're going to be engaging in. And so that started Wednesday. Friday, we were hit with probably one of the most strangest days, I think, in that I can remember. But we started off with around 4:08. We started off with a shooting that it had close to 70 rounds being fired in that shooting. We then had a couple hours later, 3 victims went to hospitals in and around the Seattle area. And a couple hours later, we then had a shooting that just wasn't too far from the first shooting at the Atlantic Street boat ramp. And we had one homicide in that, and 2 victims that were shot with gunshot wounds that went into a car and were driving up Rainier to get to the hospital, end up hitting and striking and killing somebody on their way to the hospital. And then simultaneously to that, we had a stolen vehicle involved in a collision, a rollover collision that it created some people in critical care. So we had that incident going. About 45 minutes later, we had another traffic collision hit and run, where that was also a death that resulted in that. Simultaneously, we also had the vehicle that we had in the first shooting. We stopped and recovered 3 guns that were involved in the 70 rounds being fired. And so, just in that Friday, that isn't a normal Friday. That isn't something that is, this violence just all occurred all within one day, which was close to 100 rounds being fired over the weekend. Total, with another shooting that we had in West Seattle, we were close to 140 rounds being fired. And that isn't a normal weekend. That isn't something that this is where we got to figure out how do we call upon our community to say this violence has to stop. And because there's victims in this, the community is traumatized by the rounds that are constantly being fired. And so this is so important for us to work with community on.
Maybe it also shows just how unusual these times are in having all of this go on this way.